Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. I hope you're having a great day. Hope you're getting out and getting some great images. In this video, talking about the Canon R3 again. In a recent video, I did basically a walkthrough of the entire menu system of the camera, of the R3, and I provided my thoughts on setup for birds and birds in flight. In this video, I'm going to concentrate on just the autofocus menu and setup of the autofocus for birds and birds in flight primarily. Of course, a lot of this rolls over to other types of photography, especially other types of wildlife photography. So, if you're interested in a pretty in-depth look at the Canon R3's autofocus system, stay tuned. Okay, so before I go into the menu and you can no longer see me, which is actually probably a good thing for most of you, I want to talk a little bit in general about my experiences so far with the Canon R3's autofocus system, because it will impact your thought process probably as I go through the menus and then get further down the line in the video and showing some field views of the autofocus system in action. The main point I want to make here is that the Canon R3's autofocus system is by far the most capable and flexible system I've ever used. And along with that comes a lot of different settings, a lot of different choices you can make. And if you've come to this video looking for kind of a one-size-fits-all setting or setup for your autofocus system for birds, birds in flight, wildlife photography, whatever, you're probably going to be disappointed, because to get the most out of this camera's autofocus system, you have to be willing to tweak the settings. You have to be able to go in and change up whether you're going to use a straight zone, whether you're going to use zone that rolls over to tracking, whether you're just going to go right to eye detect with tracking. The size of the zones can be changed on this camera from basically encompassing the entire frame, the entire view that you see through the viewfinder, to anything down to extremely small area. And of course, all of this can affect the ability of the autofocus to do what you want it to do, and thus the success that you're going to have using the autofocus on this camera. So there's really no one setup for any scenario, even when it comes to birds, and then birds in flight, and then wildlife. You really have to be able to analyze the scenario that you're shooting in and go in and make and tweak the settings to get the most out of what this camera can do. I'm doing some stuff this winter. It's still winter. It's winter here in Florida, and I do a lot of belted kingfisher work in the winter time. This bird's diving a second or two down to the water, back up to the perch, with, without fish, water splash involved, eye there at the beginning, eye disappearing when the bird hits the water and goes underwater. Lots of different stuff, very fast action. And I've tried a lot of different settings on this camera to, as far as autofocus goes, to see which works better. And you can really make a lot of them, a lot of different setups work, but you basically over time whittle it down to a best scenario. And for an example, for the kingfishers, what I'm doing, and I shoot back button autofocus, and so I've got autofocus methods set up for each of my 3 back buttons: the autofocus on button, the asterisk button, and the button on the far right there, which is the autofocus point select button. And the way I find works best for kingfishers, for example, or a scenario where the eye's present and the autofocus can detect it in the beginning, but once it's down, hits the water, there's no eye to see anymore, There's a lot of other potential eyes, quote unquote, out there, like water droplets coming up. So when the bird's on the perch and diving, I'm using eye detect all the way down to the water. When this split second the bird hits the water, I'm moving my thumb over, going to a zone that basically is sized to be the size of the area that's affected by the bird and the splash, so that when so the zone basically just picks up the splash and is going to focus on the splash, and that's where the bird's going to pop up. So generally you're in pretty close to perfect focus for when the bird comes back out of the water. The bird comes out of the water, the zone autofocus picks up the bird, and I track it back to the top of the perch using zone. So it's eye detect, down, move my thumb over, splash, bird back up to the perch, flying back up to the perch with zone. And then that way, generally I don't really miss much in between. The autofocus is right on the bird the entire time. I have tried sticking with eye detect all the way down, all the way back up, and it works. A lot of times it works. The split second the eye is available again to the autofocus, it finds it, gets on it, and tracks it back. But sometimes, and it's a higher failure rate than with zone, that's why I'm using the zone, sometimes it doesn't find the eye, the bird turns the other direction or a different direction, eye's not visible right away, it never gets back on the bird by the time it gets up to the perch. So this is just an example of things you need to think about when you're shooting your various scenarios for birds, birds in flight, wildlife photography in general. So now, without further ado, let's get into the menu system, the autofocus menu, and I'll go through each setting and we'll talk about it a little bit, and I'll show you how I've chosen to set it. And then once we're done with that, we're going to go out into the field a bit, and you can see how the autofocus performs in the field. And after that, we'll finish up with a summary. Okay, so here we are in the autofocus menu of the Canon R3. And some of this stuff is going to take a little bit of discussion, and some of it we're just going to blow right through because it's kind of either a very common setting, doesn't really affect things much, or the opposite where it's critical. So we'll try to give each item in the menu here its appropriate amount of attention. So we're in the first tab of the autofocus menu, and at the very top there it says servo. When we're shooting birds, birds in flight, wildlife in general, almost always on servo, not on one shot. That's the option that you have, so we're not going to spend much more time there, but it is critical that you're on servo if your subject is moving closer or further away from you. Autofocus area. Right now you see it says it's on AF with brackets and a 3 in the middle. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But the autofocus area, autofocus method, really used to be called, I guess, so now we'll just call it the autofocus area. Here's the different areas that you can use, that you can pick from, and I'm on the third zone, flexible zone 3, but you can pick from any of these, turn some of them off if you never used them. But these flexible zone AF1, 2, and 3 are a really interesting addition to the Canon R3 over the R5. And then you have this one, the whole area autofocus zone that encompasses the entire frame, like I mentioned earlier in the video. And that's something new to the R3 as well over the R5. The rest of this is pretty, if you've shot Canon cameras, is pretty familiar to you. You've got spot, you've got a one-point autofocus area, you've got an expanded autofocus area, and then of course you have an expanded all-around main autofocus area with assist points or assist areas around it. So these are the autofocus areas that you have to choose from, and for me there's 3 of these that are critical. The first is this one, spot. Spot autofocus is really important for me now, especially on these mirrorless cameras, because they do tend, sorry, to get stuck sometimes. Even when you use back button and you pump it, they get stuck on whatever they're focused on, whether it be the background or something in the foreground, not your subject. And you keep pumping it if you're in zone or if you're in eye detect, and you're telling it to look again, but it's saying, I don't need to look again. I'm already focused on something. Well, the best way to get it to focus again and focus on what you want it to focus on, your subject, is to use spot. And that's why I have my autofocus point select button, the very right back button, like I mentioned earlier, set up for spot autofocus, always. That's one reason. There's another reason we'll get into later on, because it's also functional for actual photography. The next one that's really important are just these zones. These three here, specifically the ones that you can change the size and shape of. We'll get into that in a minute. But then there's the addition of the whole area autofocus, which for me has found some usage, especially when I'm shooting video, where a subject may come and go from the frame, from a perch like the Kingfisher, and I may not track it all the time, so I want it to be focused. I want the camera to stay focused on, let's say, the perch where the bird left from. By having the entire area as the autofocus area, the entire view, it will stay on the perch. And so when the bird gets back, the bird's in focus. The camera doesn't try to refocus when the bird leaves, dives, for example. And so if you had a smaller zone set just mostly encompassing the bird, and then the bird leaves the frame, it's going to try to refocus sometimes and focus on the background or something like that and mess you up. So the three things that I'm really using a lot as far as autofocus area goes, the three areas I'm using a lot: spot, these zones, and then the whole area autofocus. So anyway, we can get back out of here now. Subject tracking. And of course, you don't have to go into the, let me backtrack here for a second. You don't have to go into the menu here to change your autofocus area. In fact, I recommend you don't do that. Set it up as a button on your camera to switch autofocus areas, to scroll through them. Use the control ring. I use the control ring on either the adapter if I'm using EF lenses, or on the RF lenses themselves. I love the control ring for scrolling quickly through and changing my autofocus areas that I'm using. So anyway, moving on to subject tracking. This is an interesting setting here. It's either on or off, so it's not like it's complicated, but how it works is different in a subtle way than if you choose it in the menu system here. If you turn it on and leave it on all the time as you're shooting, by turning it on here in the menu, versus if you turn it on using a custom button assignment. Essentially, they work the same, but they look different, and they actually act a little differently too. So it's something that takes a little while to get used to, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So be aware that if you turn it on in the menu here versus turning it off here and turning it on and off, assigning it to a button like I did, my multifunction button up near the shutter button, I've actually got that as a toggle for turning subject tracking on and off. Again, it works principally the same, but it does look different and act a little different. The one thing you cannot do, that at least I have not found, is that you can set, let's say, a button like the multifunction button like I did as a toggle on and off for subject tracking. But if it's on here in the menu like it is now, so if I go away from this, go into the menu, it's on now. If you try to turn it off with that multifunction button, it will not turn off. So it does not override this setting. This is the dominant setting. But if you turn it off in the menu like this, and you have it set to an on-off toggle for subject tracking on a button, it will turn it on and off, toggle it on and off. So be aware, it's a little different. It's not, if you set it to a button, it's not affecting this setting in the menu. And we'll go over how it looks and how it performs maybe a little bit differently when I show some footage from out in the field. The next subject to detect. Animals, that's an easy one. You don't need to spend much more time there. You can go from people to animals to vehicles to none. When we're doing birds, wildlife, we're set to animals, and it does make some difference. Eye detection, enable. If you want eye detection to be part of your autofocus performance from the camera, you need to enable eye detection here in the menu. And it will work within zone. It'll work if you use spot, if you have subject tracking on associated with spot autofocus, which I'll go over a little bit later. It will then look for an eye. No matter what autofocus area or method that you initiate autofocus with, it will be looking for the eye of your subject. Switching tracked subjects. Now, for me, I like to set it as the initial priority. Whatever I pick, and if the camera decides to focus on that, which most of the time it does, I hope, I want it to stick with that. I don't want it to make its own judgment about switching to a different subject, to a different head, to a different eye. There may be multiple eyes of multiple birds in a frame at times. We'll show that from the field work for this video. So anyway, I want to anyway, go with initial priority. The way you shoot, the scenarios you shoot in, you may want to go to a more general setting like at 1 here, or maybe all the way up to switch subject is at 2. It's really up to you, but I like initial priority. Moving on to tab number 2 here. This is an interesting development, I will say, over the last couple years now with Canon bringing out mirrorless cameras, and now with these cases that you can tweak, of course. I used to shoot case 2 all the time, continue to track subjects, ignore possible obstacles, and then I would tweak them to the settings that you see here. And it's tracking sensitivity set all the way down to the negative, and XL decel tracking set all the way to the positive. Why did I set it this way? Because when I got on a bird, and I feel like I'm fairly good at tracking birds, I don't want it to switch. I don't want it to be distracted by anything that comes into the frame. XL decel positive, because a lot of what I do is all over the place, like the kingfisher diving, stopping, coming back up, changing directions quickly and stuff like that. So for me, this setting worked really, really well. It still does for me in most cases, but Canon added this case A, automatic. For the most part, I don't like using automatic settings on cameras for my photography, but I like to mess around with stuff. So I tried using the auto setting on the R3 and subsequently on the R5, since all the firmware updates have come out on the R5, and I like the auto setting. I really do. I see it doing just as good a job as me tweaking tracking sensitivity and XL decel tracking settings in a case. So I've really come to leave this setting to auto. Give it a try. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. Maybe for your scenarios that you shoot in, it doesn't work for you. But for me, and I shoot in a lot of different scenario types of settings and shooting scenarios, I find it adapts really, really well. So, interesting. Tab number 3, one shot autofocus, release priority, not an issue for me. Preview autofocus, that's the same as the continuous autofocus in the R5. I turn that off, I disable that. Lens drive when autofocus is impossible, we want that on. We want it to cycle when it misses. Sometimes it doesn't miss, but still won't cycle because it's focused on something like I already went over. It's kind of a hiccup a little bit, but you definitely want the drive when autofocus is impossible turned on. Assist beam firing, we're not going to spend time on that because it's of no consequence here for the most part. Tab number 4, limit your autofocus areas. No, I really don't. It's so easy to scroll through them now using the control ring the way I do it, the way I like to do it, that I leave them all available. I never know when I'm going to want to try something new, something different. I'm in a scenario, things aren't working quite as well as I'd like. I want them all available. Like I said, there's so much that you can tweak and try in this camera, and I want the ability to tweak and try things, new things, as easy to get to as possible. So I'm going to not limit my autofocus areas to any particular ones. Like I said, you can go in here and you can turn some of these off, take the check marks off of them. You can see in my camera, they're all turned on. So autofocus area selection control, it's on the multifunction button. Not really. Not really. But I just don't change it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't override anything. So I just leave it that way. No changes here on the sensitivity, orientation linked autofocus. A lot of this stuff is not critical, so I'm not going to spend time on it. Try to keep this video as short as possible. Manual focusing, don't worry about it because I'm not manual focusing on birds in flight very much. I use spot if I have to. Very often, very rarely do I use manual focusing when I'm doing my wildlife work, birds in flight. Focus guide off because that's really a manual focusing thing, and we're not using it. And we go to number 6 here, electronic full-time manual focus. Turn that off. I don't want the focus rings to be working when I'm in autofocus because sometimes that can mess up when I'm panning with birds and stuff like that. So I turn that off. Maybe you want to turn it on. Lens, if you use manual focus to tweak things, if you like that, turn it on. Lens, electronic manual focus. Yeah. Focus ring rotation, not changing any of these things. Okay, so that's the autofocus menu. But there's a lot more to using the autofocus system of this camera than just setting up the menu items. Kind of alluded to some of those things already. Let's go into those in more detail. So let's go all the way down here. Go over here to custom buttons. And there's a lot of changes I've made in here, and I'll go over and show you my settings. So the half press of the shutter button, all that does is start metering. That's it. There's no autofocus involved with half press. I use back button like I mentioned earlier. We'll skip past the video part. Now you can see that the multifunction button, like I mentioned, is to start and stop subject tracking. But like I mentioned, it will not override the on setting in the menu for subject tracking if you have it turned on. It will turn it on if you have it set to off in the menu system. So this is where that kind of comes into play. Multifunction 2 button on the Canon R3 is a button in the front of the camera there, as you can see in the schematic. And I actually have that set up to take over the function of my autofocus point select button, which is the far right back button, because that does need to do something for me. I need that button active somewhere, that functionality active somewhere on the camera, and I chose to put it on the multifunction 2 button. And we'll go into why you need that functionality somewhere. If we go in a minute, if we go down to the autofocus on button, it goes directly to eye detect autofocus. The autofocus on, now this is your smart controller, that detects your thumb movement over it. I have that turned off because I don't want that to move my autofocus areas around, my autofocus point around, whatever you want to call it. I just don't use that functionality. I'd rather use the multi-controller to do that if I do it. The asterisk button is set to activate autofocus and metering. So it will activate whatever autofocus area, whatever autofocus method, however you want to put it, that I have set. That when I press the asterisk button, that's what it'll initiate. That's the autofocus area or method it will initiate. And for that, you control that. I control it with the control ring. So if I'm on zone or if I'm on a single point, if I hit the asterisk button, it's going to initiate autofocus for that method or area. For the autofocus point selection button, I have it set to register and recall shooting functions. And this is why I had to replicate the autofocus point select button on the multifunction 2 button on the front of the camera, because I'm using this button for something else. This is what I'm using it for. If we go in here, you can go to detail set and you can see how I've got it set up here. I don't want, when I press that button on the back of the camera, I don't want it to recall shooting mode or shutter speed or aperture, ISO speed, or any of these things. The only thing that I want it to do is to use a certain autofocus area, and that here is spot autofocus. I want it to track the subject. The subject I want it to track is an animal. Spot detection is on by default. I want eye detection on, tracking sensitivity set how I would have it set in case 2, like I showed you earlier. And the autofocus start position being on the spot autofocus area. And then, of course, I want it to institute or initiate autofocus, start the autofocus when I hit the button, and continue the autofocus as long as I hit the button. So, and it's on servo. So this is how I have it set up. Now, this is where one of those that you can tweak this to your heart's content. You can have it not do eye detect, but just track the subject, not look for eyes necessarily. You can have it not start at the actual spot, but that's really what I want, because that's how I pick out individual birds in a crowd, and we'll see that a little bit later on. Stuff like that. So you can go in here and tweak this to your heart's content about how you want it exactly to perform. So we'll get out of here, and that's basically the most important parts. And one thing I'm not going to talk about in this autofocus video is this right here, is eye control. Controlling a target, controlling where your autofocus is, autofocus point moves to, stuff like that with your eye. For birds in flight, I really haven't found it to be very important or useful. Some of you may disagree with that. It's not that it doesn't work. It actually works very well. But I much prefer to use a spot autofocus in the middle of the frame and use that as kind of like a gun sight and put it on the head of the bird or the bird that I want, hit the far right button, and it's going to grab that bird's head or eye and track it from that point on. I find that to be just as fast or more effective, just more intuitive for me than trying to control where things are happening autofocus-wise with my eye. It just happens too fast for me to be doing it with my eye. I'd much rather do it with the method I just kind of outlined for you. Okay, so customized dials, we'll go in there real quick. And you can see the one thing I'll show you is that my control ring is set up to select the autofocus area, like I mentioned a few times. So let's go in here real quick and let's hit that multifunction 2 button up front, like I mentioned, and see what happens here about these zones, these flexible zones. So you can see right now I'm scrolling through using my control ring to autofocus zone, flexible zone 1, which is that big, flexible zone 2, a little bit bigger, flexible zone 3, a little bit bigger, flexible zone 4, the whole frame. Now these 1, 2, and 3 flexible zones, I set those sizes myself. for my particular scenarios, so I can scroll through them relatively quickly, but I can always tweak them. Hit the multifunction 2 button, then hit the rate button, and now I can use the main dial up front by the shutter button and the thumb wheel to change the size and shape of my flexible zones. I love this. You can go down to something relatively small, boom. You can go up to almost the full frame. You hit set after this, hit the set button, the OK button, and it will remember that. So the zones, the flexible zone 1, 2, and 3 are really just bins for zone settings that you might want to preset. They're presets. And I love that. I really do. So now you can see that my 1, I'll hit set. We can get out of there. So now that's my zone, that's my flexible zone 1 now. That's 2 and that's 3. So 1's really big. I don't want it that way, so I'm going to go back in and change it. Go like that, hit the rate button, bring it back down to the smaller size that I had it before, somewhere in there. Looks good, hit the set button, back out of the menus, and now when I go to my preset autofocus zone area 1, it's small again. So there you go. That's really cool. It's really flexible, and I really love that. And so now you're starting, I think, to get an idea of how flexible this system is. You can go with a straight zone functionality. You can start out with the zone, the small zone being the point at which the autofocus looks for an eye, if you have eye detection on and tracking on, subject tracking on, and that's where it will start. It won't look anywhere else outside these brackets, or you can have this as your starting point, or you can have this zone as your starting point, or you can have the entire frame as your starting point if you want. You can go to eye detect, or you can go to spot, boom, like that. It's looking for an eye. It's looking for a subject right now. It's not going to find one, of course, because we're not really looking at anything other than the lens cap. So, but if there was a bird's head or eye there, which you'll see in a minute, with the field video that I took about the functionality of the autofocus, it would grab and switch from that spot to tracking, eye detect, and it would then track the bird's eye around the entire frame. So again, tons of flexibility here. So from this point on, I am going to go over to some video I took in the field and demonstrate at least a little bit about how this autofocus system in this camera functions. Okay, in this part of the video, I'm going to try to show you how these different autofocus settings work. Zone with subject tracking, with eye detect. And you can see what I'm doing right now is I've actually got it on zone with subject tracking turned on in the menu of the camera. So it puts the pre-focus box on the bird. And then when you hit I have it set up for back button autofocus. So once I hit it, the box turns blue. The bracket for the zone goes away, and it now will track the bird's eye, in this case head, throughout the frame. I let go, the bracket comes back on for the zone, and it will only focus on that in the zone. If I go outside the zone, it turns black, and if I try to focus now, it won't do such a great job as it would if it was in the zone. And there you go, now it's got the eye. So this is how zone works with subject tracking on in the menu system and with eye detect on. Now if you go, and the way I have my camera set up is I have on the multifunction button right by the shutter button there set up to turn to toggle subject tracking on and off. I can hit the button like I just did, and now the brackets look different. That's telling you that I turned subject tracking on via the button assignment and not through the menu. It's got the double box versus the single box. And if I go ahead and press my back button to actually get focus going, servo focus, the bracket goes away and we've got basically what we had before. So no matter how, now I'm going to hit that button, the multifunction button again, and we're back into regular tracking, subject tracking. Now of course the bird's eye went away, so it's on the bird's body now, but we're on regular subject tracking through the menu. Now if we go into the menu and I turn subject tracking to off, you will see now that we have, if I hit the same back button, which is set up for to initiate autofocus for whatever main autofocus method I have chosen, it will now do just straight zone autofocus with all the blue boxes going around it. It'll still look for the bird's eye and head. Someone must be coming to feed the birds because they're all flying over there. But now if I turn on with the multifunction button tracking, the minute I do that, the brackets for zone go away. I get the double box. And I can track throughout the frame. The starting point though is still inside the zone brackets. So it basically functions the same as if you have subject tracking turned on in the menu system versus toggling it via a button assignment. It just looks a little different, but basically does the same thing. There goes my great blue heron that I really wanted to continue to watch. But let's go over here and turn subject tracking on, hit that, and we'll take a head of a white ibis instead. So he's going to pop up and down. It does behave differently though when you do a button assignment for subject tracking. You can see that if there's no subject, after a while, if you don't focus, it turns off. It doesn't stay on. So now you have to hit it again to get it to come on. And then once you focus, you're fine. You can track throughout the frame. Let's see if we can find something that's a little bit more visible. Wild birds, you know, they don't always want to cooperate with you. So anyway, this is how, it's a little bit of the difference between subject tracking turned on by a button assignment through custom button setup versus turning it on in the menu here. We can go back and turn it back on again, and you can see what it does is it tells you what it's going to focus on before you hit your back button or your half press, which I kind of like better, and I wish it would act the same way when you use the button assignment way of toggling it on and off. Again, if I hit that button now, it never turns it off completely. It doesn't override the assignment that you make to subject tracking being on in the actual menu of the camera. So I wish it did, but it doesn't. So that's the different ways that you can implement subject tracking with iDetect, and it does a really good job. And you can change, like I'll change the size of the bracket here. I've got several bracket setups, several zone setups, custom ones for zones 1, 2, and 3, flexible zones set up for different sizes. And you can see now with auto focus, subject detect on in the menu system, anywhere if I go outside the zone, it turns black and it won't focus. But anything that's in the zone will allow you to focus on it, and it'll tell you ahead of time what it's looking at and what it would focus on, like that, once you either press half press or your back button for autofocus. I'm going to use spot now. When it gets off, now I've got my far right back button, which is the autofocus point select button, set up for spot autofocus for just that kind of scenario where it goes completely off the subjects onto grass or a background. You can always go to spot and try to get it to find the subject that way again, and it did right there. Now I can go back. So this is a tough one here. Let's try going down here. There's roseate spoonbill down there. That's a long ways down there, but it's still finding heads and things. And so we can talk about that next, is about spot autofocus and the importance that I find it has to my autofocus setup on the R3. And that's for when you have multiple birds close together or it's a challenging situation with grass. I go to spot like I just did there, and I have with spot, I have eye detect with tracking turned on, and that's in the customized button menu. So I have register a shooting function, and I have that set up that way, and we'll go into that in another part of the video about how I set that up. But now that it's out in the open with just subject tracking on in the menu system, you can see we're back to where we were before, where it pretty much tracks within the zone. And of course, it's nice that you can make the zone smaller and smaller in the sense that it will then allow you to focus in on one subject when there might be a lot of subjects out there and you want it to find just one of them, and the extreme version of that is going to spot just like that, and having eye detect with tracking set up to turn on and be active along with spot autofocus, because now we're just on eye detect with tracking again. Some roseate spoonbills just flew by. Maybe they'll come over closer to us and we can use them as subjects. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit here while you can see it is these flexible zones. So you can see I've got my main autofocus method selection set up to my control ring, and as I scroll through them you can see them in the little tape down below there, and you can see AF1 here, AF2 and AF3, and then the full frame autofocus zone setting. And what's cool about the way Canon implemented this is that those icons change when you have autofocus subject tracking turned on in the menu system. It puts those little icons with the dot and the 3 lines next to it. If I turn them off in the menu system, you can see what happens here. If I can turn subject tracking off and I go back to that, you will see that those icons are no longer there. So you know if you have subject tracking turned on in the menu system, you can see it just by looking at your main autofocus method here. I'm going to turn it back on again, and now get back into shooting mode here, and you can see those icons are back. And what I love about Canon's autofocus zones now is that you can, those 3 zone presets, I call them autofocus zone presets, can be basically made the size that you want. And I've got 3 of them custom set up now. This is number 1, that's number 2, and that's number 3. They're all getting a little bit bigger each time. And then of course you have the 4th one, which is Canon's full frame zone. Takes into account the entire view. And so I really like that you can customize these. To customize them, I've got it set up to where when I'm on a zone like this, on the multifunction 2 button on the front of the camera, if you press that, it brings up this menu, if you want to call it a menu, and then if you hit the rate button, now you can see that I can change the size and the shape of this zone by using the main dial and the thumb wheel. And I really like that, and I've customized, as I said, 3 different zone sizes to have them ready at my beck and call. And you can see as I'm going through this, it's telling me the pre-focus area with subject tracking on is that great egret's head there, and it's outside the zone, but if I make the zone big enough and encompass that, it turns white from the gray. And then if I hit my asterisk button, which is my autofocus on now, the way I have my camera set up, it turns blue, and now that bird's in focus. So I really, really like how Canon has implemented the autofocus system in this camera. It is so flexible with regards to setting up your autofocus system for just about any scenario. And I'm going to mention it a couple times in this video, I'm sure, is that there's no just one setup for birds in flight now, for wildlife in general, for autofocus. There's not one size fits all. There's so many things you can change in the autofocus now on the R3 and even on the R5. These cameras have so many choices now, so many things you can tweak. You really need to assess the scenario you're shooting and tweak and set up your autofocus system. Hey, you got a fish there. Or a tadpole or something, for the scenario that you're shooting in. Don't think that one size can fit all. It's not going to work that way. So now we got a great blue heron coming into the picture here. He wants in on the action. So here we go, we can focus now. I've got set up to full frame zone right now, and it's doing a great job tracking that great egret's eye and head as he's moving down the shoreline. The last thing I want to talk about while I'm out in the field is, the way that I approach setting up my autofocus for different scenarios. I really like to use the eye detect with tracking a lot, and so I have a button, my autofocus on button on the back of my camera, set just to eye detect, and I will use that 80% of the time. But I like the zones, especially being able to go to spot autofocus like that and putting it right on the head of the bird I want, and it'll switch over to tracking immediately, and then that way I can pick the bird that I want. I want this bird, bam, got him, just like that. And that's using spot set up on my autofocus point select button, rather than having the camera pick what you want, and it will do a good job of that. Oop, that one's going behind a tree. Go back to the great blue here. Boom, just like that. If I let go, it's going to track it, tell me that it sees that head. But what happens when you get into a scenario with a bunch of birds like those over there? It's too far away to really make a good example here. But look what it's doing. It doesn't know which bird to pick. They're just all right next to each other. There's tons of eyes and heads there. If I was closer and I could single out one of those with the spot autofocus, I just put the spot on the bird I want, and it would focus on that. And I might try to work my way down there and show you that example. But all in all, I love eye detect, and I love the fact that, in tracking, and I love the fact that you can customize it so much for a scenario where you have just one bird, like this great blue heron over here, where it's automatically just going to find the bird for you, the bird's eye even, and then you've got it if you're in zone with subject tracking on with eye detect enabled. Or if you go into a scenario like this over here where you've got all of these birds, you can use spot. Let's see if I can like to try to track a flying bird here for you. It's hard because I'm using a Ninja 5 right now, so I can't look through the viewfinder. I'm having to look at the back of the Ninja, but you can see what it's doing here. So now let's go ahead and smallen up the zone, make the zone smaller, and now it's not going to even look at those birds to try to focus on them way over on the right there, only within the zone. So this is how you can use the zone and the sizes of the zones to pick out the specific subject that you want and make sure that the autofocus system grabs that subject. So let's walk down, see if we can get a little bit closer to the ibis. Okay, so I moved down, and you can see that, boom, it told me which bird it was going to pick with the subject tracking on in the menu system like that. Let me go here and let's do this. Let's go to spot on the actual autofocus method, and you can see the size of what we're dealing with, boom. But I also have it, that just provides you kind of a target then to put right on the bird that you want. Oop, there we go. It's not perfect, but I'll tell you what, it's pretty good. If the eye's there. So what I'm getting at here is you can mess around a lot with these settings to get it to perform the way you want it to in the scenario that you're shooting. Don't think that there's a one size fits all and that, oh, this thing doesn't work. You've got to mess with this, and you've got to change the settings And you got to try different autofocus methods. You're not going to use a zone in here and get the exact bird that you want. This thing can do just about anything. It can adapt to just about any kind of scenario that you want to do. You just have to be open to tweaking things, to changing the zones, changing from zone to eye detect, changing all the different parameters of these things to fit the scenario that you want to shoot. If you do that, you're going to find that this system is pretty good at dealing with just about any scenario that you're going to get into. Let's go to full zone here again. That's the full frame, and there you go. But by having three different autofocus methods assigned to the 3 back buttons on my camera, I can go from zone to eye detect to spot eye detect just by moving my thumb, and it's really awesome. And I've yet to find a scenario that I really can't deal with pretty well. So we're going to head back inside and we will continue talking about the autofocus system of the Canon R3 in detail. Okay, so I hope this video provided you with some information that was useful. Maybe some stuff you haven't heard before or haven't seen before. One thing I want to point out that I didn't mention in the video to this point, there's that little dot right in the middle of the frame. That's something new. Canon doesn't have that on the R5, and I haven't seen it before the R3. And it's really nice because that comes on when you have your autofocus area, whether it be a zone or whatever, in the center of the frame. If you move it off center, you'll notice that little bitty dot square goes away. So you always know if you have your autofocus area oriented in the center of the frame. And I like that. I like it so much that I wish that that little dot wouldn't necessarily go away when you hit your autofocus initiation, because it does. If you hit your back button, that little point will go away. I wish it would stay there as a reference to the center of the frame, but it doesn't. Always little things, right? Always little things, but for the most part, I'm really loving my R3. I hope you are too, or if you're considering getting one, that this helps you. Maybe make up your mind to get one or not get one. No camera system is perfect. The R3 is a great, great camera, and I'm going to continue to shoot it, especially in scenarios where I need fast shutter speeds. This thing can go well above 1/8,000th of a second when I need fast autofocus, any scenarios that are ultra fast like the Kingfisher and things like that. Until next time then, stay safe, have great light, take great images, and I'll see you soon.